When Mr. Frederick Douglass returned to the plantation of Covey the Negro Breaker, there was something different about Covey's character. He was gentle, he was kind, and he was a bit soft-spoken the way he addressed Mr. Douglass. Now, this was strange because just the morning prior, he attempted to tie him up and whip him for running off. Was it the Sabbath day, the magical root Mr. Douglass received from Sandy the Genuine African? A combination of both or neither that caused this otherwise vicious man to act in such a manner? Whatever the cause, in his 1855 autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, Mr. Douglass tells us that all went well for him until Monday morning. And then, whether the root had lost its virtue, or whether my tormentor had gone deeper into the black art than myself, as was sometimes said of him, or whether he had obtained a special indulgence for his faithful Sabbath day's worship, it is not necessary for me to know or to inform the reader. But this I may say, the pious and benignant smile which graced Covey's face on Sunday wholly disappeared on Monday. Whether the root lost its magical powers, whether his faithfulness to the Sabbath gave him a special pass for the rest of the week to be cruel, or whether Covey had delved deep into the black art, the magic of the devil, he didn't know, but what he realized was the gentleness expressed by Covey on Sunday had entirely vanished on Monday. Long before daylight, I was called up to go and feed, rub, and curry the horses. I obeyed the call and would have so obeyed it had it been made at an earlier hour, for I had brought my mind to a firm resolve during that Sunday's reflection, viz., to obey every order, however unreasonable if it were possible, and, if Mr. Covey should then undertake to beat me, to defend and protect myself to the best of my ability. He knew he had to be on his best behavior. He was already overdue for lashings because he ran off. So no talking back or impudent activities that demonstrated resistance. But if Covey still tried to beat on him, then he already decided that he was going to protect himself, which was not supposed to be done by slaves. My religious views on the subject of resisting my master had suffered a serious shock by the savage persecution to which I had been subjected, and my hands were no longer tied by my religion. Slave masters use biblical passages like Ephesians 6 verse 5, slaves obey your earthly master with fear and respect, and they use them to instill obedience and submission into the slaves through the authority of the Christian God. And Mr. Douglass is tossing that teaching out of the window at this point. He says, Master Thomas's indifference had served the last link. I had now to this extent backslidden from this point in the slave's religious creed, and I soon had occasion to make my fallen state known to my Sunday pious brother, Covey. And not obeying the slave religious creed would earn someone the reputation as a backslider, which in this circumstance, Mr. Douglass was content with that reputation, as he was about to make his fallen state known to Covey if he tried to put his hands on him. These were his thoughts, and just as he was in the stable doing everything right and following Covey's orders to the T to feed the horse and to get them ready for the field, Covey sneaked into the stable in his peculiar snake-like way, and seizing me suddenly by the leg, he brought me to the stable floor, giving my newly mended body a fearful jar. Oh, snaps, here we go. I now forgot my roots and remembered my pledge to stand up in my own defense. The brute was endeavoring skillfully to get a slip knot on my legs before I could draw up my feet. As soon as I found what he was up to, I gave a sudden spring. My 2 days' rest had been of much service to me, and by that means, no doubt, he was able to bring me to the floor so heavily. He was defeated in his plan of tying me. While down, he seemed to think he had me very securely in his power. He little thought he was, as the rowdies say, in for a rough and tumble fight. But such was the fact. It's time to squabble. Mr. Douglass wasn't going to get bullied this time. Whence came the daring spirit necessary to grapple with a man who, 48 hours before, could with his slightest word have made me tremble like a leaf in a storm? I do not know. At any rate, I was resolved to fight, and what was better still, I was actually hard at it. He could fight, and fight hard too. How he went from scared of this man to squabbling, he doesn't know. But the warrior spirit had come upon him, and I found my strong fingers firmly attached to the throat of my cowardly tormentor. as heedless of consequences at the moment, as though we stood as equals before the law. The very color of the man was forgotten. The fact that Covey was categorized as white didn't matter at this point. I felt as supple as a cat, and was ready for the snakish creature at every turn. Every blow of his was parried, though I dealt no blows in turn. He did the Floyd Mayweather on Covey. He was blocking every blow that Covey threw his way. I was strictly on the defensive, preventing him from injuring me rather than trying to injure him. I flung him on the ground several times when he meant to have hurled me there. I held him so firmly by the throat that his blood followed my nails. Let me go and get some fruits and pistachio snacks while watching this, because this is getting good. He held me, and I held him. All was fair thus far, and the contest was about equal. My resistance was entirely unexpected, and Covey was taken all aback by it, for he trembled in every limb. "Uh-oh," and Covey said this.
"Are you going to resist, you scoundrel?"
said he. To which I returned a polite, "Yes, sir," steadily gazing my interrogator in the eye to meet the first approach or dawning of the blow, which I expected my answer would call forth. But the conflict did not long remain thus equal. Covey soon cried out lustily for help. Don't start crying out for help. The Negro breaker should not need to holler for any help. But the reason he cried out was not that I was obtaining any marked advantage over him or was injuring him, but because he was gaining none over me and was not able, single-handed, to conquer me. He couldn't subdue him by himself. He called for his cousin Hughes. To do what? To come to his assistance. And now the scene was changed. 2-on-1. Now they want to jump him. Let's see how that worked out. I was compelled to give blows as well as to parry them, and since I was, in any case, to suffer for resistance, I felt, as the musty proverb goes, that I might as well be hanged for an old sheep as a lamb, meaning he was going to get punished for resisting regardless. So he might as well go out throwing blows and fighting back rather than just submitting without a struggle. So that's what he did. I was still defensive toward Covey, but aggressive toward Hughes. And at the first approach of the latter, I dealt a blow in my desperation, which fairly sickened my youthful assailant. Cousin Hughes took this blow, and how did he respond? He went off, bending over with pain and manifesting no disposition to come within my reach again. He felt that hot fire and quickly realized that he no longer wanted to stay in Mr. Douglas's kitchen. And here's how it happened. The poor fellow was in the act of trying to catch and tie my right hand, and while flattering himself with success, I gave him the kick which sent him staggering away in pain, at the same time that I held Covey with a firm hand. Ooh! Taken completely by surprise, Covey seemed to have lost his usual strength and coolness. Covey must have realized he didn't want to catch one of those kicks like his cousin did. So he was frightened and stood puffing and blowing, seemingly unable to command words or blows. When he saw that poor Hughes was standing half bent with pain, his courage quite gone, the cowardly tyrant asked if I meant to persist in my resistance. I told him I did mean to resist, come what might, that I had been by him treated like a brute during the last 6 months, and that I should stand it no longer. With that, he gave me a shake and attempted to drag me toward a stick of wood that was lying just outside the stable door. He meant to knock me down with it, but just as he leaned over to get the stick, I seized him with both hands by the collar, and with a vigorous and sudden snatch, I brought my assailant harmlessly his full length on the not over-clean ground, for we were now in the cow yard, on cow dung, dueling it out. He had selected the place for the fight, and it was but right that he should have all the advantages of his own selection, which he had. But even with those advantages, Mr. Douglas was still too much fight for Covey. And while Mr. Douglas was being held, Covey called upon Bill for assistance. Now he's hollering for Bill. And who is Bill? Another slave that was hired out to work for Covey. Now let's hear what happened after Covey called out for Bill. The scene here had something comic about it. Bill, who knew precisely what Covey wished him to do, affected ignorance and pretended he did not know what to do. Acting dumb or playing the fool was another ways of wisdom for slaves. The whites already assumed that they were dumb, so some of the slaves learned to use this assumption to their advantage, just like Bill's doing here when Covey called upon him.
"What shall I do, Mr. Covey?"
said Bill.
"Take hold of him! Take hold of him!"
said Covey, with a toss of his head, peculiar to Bill, he said,
Indeed, Mr. Covey, I want to go to work.
This is your work.
said Covey.
Take hold of him.
Bill replied with spirit.
My master hired me here to work, and not to help you whip Frederick.
It was now my turn to speak. Bill, said I, don't put your hands on me. To which he replied,
My God, Frederick, I ain't going to touch you.
And Bill walked off, leaving Covey and myself to settle our matters as best we might. So Cousin Hugh is still slumped over on the side in pain from that kick. And Bill is refusing to help, which there's a reason why he's so bold in his refusal, which we'll touch on in a bit. So with these two not providing any assistance, what is Covey to do now? He's got one last option, and that's to get some help from his big and powerful slave woman named Caroline. Mr. Douglass says that she could have easily overpowered him at this point of his exhaustion, so he was a bit worried at this point. She just happened to be coming into the cow yard where they were fighting to do some milking, and as soon as she came into the yard, Covey attempted to rally her to his aid. Strangely, and I may add, fortunately, Caroline was in no humor to take a hand in any such sport. She wasn't in the mood to help anyone, so she didn't. Mr. Douglass says, we were all in open rebellion that morning. Caroline answered the command of her master to take hold of me, precisely as Bill had answered, but in her, it was at greater peril so to answer. She was the slave of Covey, and he could do what he pleased with her. It was not so with Bill, and Bill knew it. Samuel Harris, to whom Bill belonged, did not allow his slaves to be beaten unless they were guilty of some crime which the law would punish. That's why Bill was so bold in his refusal to help. But poor Caroline, like myself, was at the mercy of the merciless Covey, nor did she escape the dire effects of her refusal. He gave her several sharp blows. This stuff is wild, isn't it? So after 2 hours of tussling, Covey finally calls it quits. He must have realized that he wasn't going to win this fight, or he wasn't going to get anywhere close to subduing Mr. Douglass. So with the fight broken up, Covey gets up and he tells Douglass this.
Now, you scoundrel, go to your work. I would not have whipped you half so much as I have, had you not resisted.
In his mind, he had convinced himself he won. But Mr. Douglass says the fact was he had not whipped me at all. He had not, in all the scuffle, drawn a single drop of blood from me. I had drawn blood from him, and even without this satisfaction I should have been victorious, because my aim had not been to injure him, but to prevent his injuring me. During the whole 6 months that I lived with Covey, after this transaction, he never laid on me the weight of his finger in anger. He would occasionally say he did not want to have to get hold of me again, a declaration which I had no difficulty in believing, and I had a secret feeling which answered, you need not wish to get hold of me again, for you will be likely to come off worse in a second fight than you did in the first. Well, my dear reader, this battle with Mr. Covey, undignified as it was, and as I fear my narration of it is, was the turning point in my life as a slave. He had done the unthinkable by standing his ground against Covey the Negro Breaker, and this must have allowed him to regain some of his dignity that he lost during the initial 6 months with Covey. It was surely a boost of confidence that brought him closer to the consciousness of a free person. He said earlier in his book that a person who's whipped easiest is whipped the most. And the person who stands up for themselves in the end becomes a free person. And that's what he hoped to do. But his time had not come yet. He still had more trials and tribulations to make it out of Egypt into the promised land, as we'll see as we continue. I thank you for your time. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.